Beneath the ancient oaks of St. Michael's Cemetery in Charleston, South Carolina, 9 graves remained a subject the city's most influential families refused to acknowledge. Each headstone marks the final resting place of a wealthy plantation owner who passed between 1851 and 1855, all under strangely identical circumstances. Sudden paralysis followed by what period physicians termed a merciful death. Then in 1923, during cemetery renovations, groundskeepers uncovered something horrifying that city officials immediately ordered sealed from public records. Inside each of those 9 coffins, deep scratch marks from fingernails covered the wooden lids, and the bodies were positioned in ways suggesting desperate struggles. What authorities discovered next would haunt Charleston's elite across generations. A leather journal buried beneath the cemetery's oldest magnolia tree, written in the careful hand of a man named Solomon Fairfax, detailing 4 years of calculated vengeance that began with the family's screams and concluded with 9 men buried alive. Before we explore Solomon Fairfax's story and the dark secret that transformed a gentle healer into Charleston's most methodical killer, we need you to join our community of truth seekers. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss these buried stories from America's past. And comment below, what state are you listening from? We love hearing from our audience across the country. The journal's first entry, dated March 15, 1851, opened with a single line that explained everything. Today, I watched my wife and children burn, and I did nothing to stop it. Charleston in the 1850s stood as the crown jewel of Southern aristocracy, where white-columned mansions lined the Cooper River and fortunes built on rice and cotton created dynasties believing themselves untouchable. The city's medical community, though small, commanded enormous respect among wealthy elites who could afford private physicians for their increasingly frequent ailments, mysterious fevers, sudden weakness, and strange paralytic conditions that seemed to plague Charleston's most prominent families with alarming regularity. Dr. Cornelius Hathaway had established his practice on Meeting Street in 1845, quickly gaining reputation among Charleston's upper class for his innovative treatments and unusual understanding of exotic remedies. His success stemmed partly from his exceptional assistant, a slave named Solomon Fairfax, possessing an almost supernatural knowledge of medicinal plants and chemical compounds. Solomon had been purchased specifically for Dr. Hathaway's practice after demonstrating remarkable skills in botanical medicine, skills passed down through generations of his family who had served as healers on various plantations throughout the Carolina Low Country. Solomon Fairfax was not the typical field slave populating Charleston's plantations. Standing tall with intelligent eyes cataloging every detail of his surroundings. He had been educated alongside his previous master's children, learning to read and write before such education became strictly forbidden. His knowledge of Latin medical terms impressed even Dr. Hathaway, who had come to rely heavily on Solomon's ability to prepare complex compounds and assist with delicate procedures. Wealthy patients visiting Hathaway's practice grew comfortable with Solomon's presence, often requesting him specifically for his gentle bedside manner and seemingly intuitive understanding of their ailments. But Solomon's life had not always been confined to the sterile walls of a medical practice. For 32 years before coming to Dr. Hathaway, he had lived on the Pemberton plantation 15 miles outside Charleston, where he married a woman named Celia and raised 3 children, 2 boys and a girl, in one of the plantation's slave quarters. The Pembertons had allowed this arrangement because Solomon's healing skills proved invaluable during frequent outbreaks of fever and disease that could devastate a plantation's workforce overnight. Solomon's expertise had saved countless lives, both slave and free, earning him unusual respect for someone in his position. He had developed treatments for everything from snake bites to consumption, using traditional African remedies passed down from his grandmother combined with new techniques he learned by carefully observing white physicians occasionally visiting the plantation. The Pembertons had even allowed him to tend their own family during illness, a privilege demonstrating genuine trust in his abilities. However, this relative comfort ended abruptly in March 1851 when Edmund Pemberton's gambling debts forced him to sell portions of his human property to cover mounting financial obligations. The sale would include Solomon's wife and children, separated and sent to different plantations across the state, a common practice plantation owners justified as business necessity but which destroyed families as effectively as any natural disaster. Solomon had pleaded with Edmund Pemberton, offering to work additional years without compensation if his family could remain together. He had even suggested alternative arrangements, perhaps hiring himself to other plantations during peak seasons to generate additional income. But Pemberton, facing creditors demanding immediate payment, refused all negotiations. The sale was scheduled for March 14, 1851 at the Charleston slave market, and nothing would change that decision. The morning of March 14 dawned gray and humid with storm clouds gathering over the Ashley River as if nature sensed the unfolding tragedy. Solomon had spent the previous night holding his family close in their small cabin, memorizing every detail of their faces, every sound of their breathing, knowing sunrise would bring permanent separation. Celia, his wife of 15 years, had maintained composure throughout the ordeal, focusing her energy on preparing their children for what lay ahead. 8-year-old Marcus, the eldest, had inherited Solomon's intelligence and curiosity about the world beyond the plantation. 6-year-old Samuel possessed his father's gentle nature and natural affinity for healing, often helping Solomon gather medicinal plants from surrounding woods. Their daughter, 4-year-old Grace, clung to her mother with instinctive understanding that something terrible was about to happen, though she couldn't comprehend the full scope awaiting them. As slave traders arrived to collect their human cargo, Solomon watched helplessly while his family was loaded onto a wagon alongside 6 other families being torn apart by Edmund Pemberton's financial desperation. Children's tears mixed with parents' desperate promises that they would find each other again somehow, someday, promises everyone knew were lies designed to ease unbearable pain. But the true horror began during the journey to Charleston's slave market. Halfway to the city, one wagon wheel struck a deep rut in the rain-soaked road, causing the vehicle to tip precariously. In the confusion following, Celia fell from the wagon, striking her head against a sharp rock-embedded roadside. Blood immediately flowed from the wound, and Solomon, despite shackled hands, tried desperately to reach her. The slave traders, concerned only with delivering cargo in saleable condition, made a decision haunting Solomon for the rest of his life. Rather than seeking medical attention for Celia, they declared her a loss and ordered the wagon to continue without her. Solomon screamed and fought against restraints as they left his wife bleeding and unconscious roadside. But other slaves held him back, knowing resistance would only result in punishment for everyone. The nightmare intensified at the Charleston slave market, where Solomon was forced to watch his children sold to separate buyers. Marcus was purchased by a rice planter from Georgetown specializing in child labor for dangerous irrigation work in alligator-infested swamps. Samuel was bought by a cotton farmer from the upcountry whose reputation for working slaves to death was well known throughout the region. Grace, too young for field work, was sold to a family in Savannah as a house servant, disappearing forever into the vast human bondage network connecting southern cities. Through all this, Solomon maintained an outward appearance of resignation, knowing any display of emotion or resistance would worsen his situation. Inside, however, something fundamental had broken. The man who had dedicated his life to healing, to preserving life and easing suffering, watched everything he loved destroyed by casual cruelty from men viewing human beings as property to liquidate when convenient. Dr. Hathaway, unaware of Solomon's tragedy's full scope, purchased him primarily for medical skills, paying a premium price reflecting Solomon's reputation as an exceptional healer. The doctor had heard about Solomon's abilities from other physicians witnessing his work at the Pemberton plantation, desperately needing someone with advanced knowledge of medicinal compounds to help with his growing practice. As Solomon was led from the slave market to begin his new life as Dr. Hathaway's assistant, he cast one final look back at where his family had been scattered to the winds. In that moment, something cold and calculating settled into his heart, a patience allowing him to wait, learn, and eventually make those responsible pay a price matching their crime's enormity. That evening, alone in the small room above Dr. Hathaway's practice serving as his new quarters, Solomon began writing in a leather journal he had managed to keep hidden throughout the ordeal. His first entry, written by candlelight in the careful script learned as a child, began with words defining the next 4 years. Today I watched my wife and children burn, and I did nothing to stop it. But I'm still alive, and I remember every face, every name, every voice that laughed as my world ended. They think they've broken me, but they've only taught me patience. The months following Solomon's arrival at Dr. Hathaway's practice passed in a blur of routine medical procedures and careful observation. Solomon performed duties with the same quiet competence always shown, mixing compounds, preparing treatment rooms, assisting with patient care. But beneath this acceptance facade, he conducted an entirely different study, learning intimate details of Charleston's medical community and wealthy families comprising Dr. Hathaway's clientele. Dr. Hathaway, a widower in his 50s with no children, had come to rely heavily on Solomon's expertise. The doctor suffered from arthritis, making precise work increasingly difficult, and Solomon's steady hands and encyclopedic medicinal knowledge had become indispensable to the practice. More importantly, for Solomon's developing plans, Dr. Hathaway had begun allowing him to handle certain patient interactions independently, particularly with chronic conditions requiring regular monitoring and treatment. Charleston's wealthy elite, accustomed to finest medical care, initially viewed Solomon with typical casual indifference and condescending approval, characterizing their interactions with skilled slaves. However, his obvious competence and respectful demeanor gradually earned trust level, proving crucial to his plans. Patients began requesting him specifically, praising his gentle touch and apparent intuitive understanding of their conditions. During this period, Solomon methodically researched every wealthy family visiting the practice. He learned about business dealings, social connections, and most importantly, their involvement in the slave trade, destroying his family. Through careful listening and discreet inquiries among other slaves working in Charleston's grand houses, he compiled detailed information about men who had participated in or profited from the auction, scattering his children across the South. His investigation revealed Edmund Pemberton as merely one link in a much larger exploitation chain. The Charleston slave market operated with support and participation from the city's most respected citizens, men serving on church boards and charitable committees while simultaneously treating human beings as livestock to buy and sell for profit. These were the men attending elegant dinner parties, discussing literature and philosophy, while their wealth was built on suffering of families like Solomon's. Among Dr. Hathaway's regular patients, Solomon identified 9 men directly connected to his family's destruction. Some had attended the auction, bidding on human cargo with detached interest they might show, purchasing horses or cattle. Others had provided financial backing for slave trading operations, lending money to dealers specializing in breaking up families to maximize profits. A few had purchased slaves from the same auction, selling his children, contributing to the system treating human beings as disposable commodities. As 1851 progressed into 1852, Solomon began experiencing what he privately called his education in advanced chemistry. Dr. Hathaway's medical library contained numerous texts on pharmaceutical compounds, including detailed descriptions of various substances producing paralysis, unconsciousness, or death's appearance while leaving the victim's mind fully aware. These books, written for legitimate medical purposes, became Solomon's textbooks in a revenge curriculum. The most significant discovery came in a treatise on South American plant toxins, describing a compound derived from a vine growing in the Amazon basin but successfully cultivated in a Charleston botanist's greenhouse, supplying exotic specimens to wealthy collectors. This particular toxin, properly prepared, could induce complete muscular paralysis while leaving the victim's consciousness and pain sensation entirely intact. The affected person would appear dead to casual observation but remain fully aware of surroundings for several hours before the toxin's effects proved fatal. Solomon spent months learning to identify and cultivate the plant, eventually locating specimens in the greenhouse of Dr. Hathaway's friend, Professor Nathaniel Crenshaw, teaching natural sciences at the College of Charleston. Professor Crenshaw, unaware of Solomon's true botanical interest, was delighted finding someone sharing his passion for exotic plant species and began allowing Solomon to help maintain his greenhouse collection. Through careful experimentation with laboratory mice, Solomon determined the precise dosage needed for desired effects. Too little would merely cause temporary weakness. Too much would result in immediate death, but the correct amount would create a state indistinguishable from death to anyone lacking extensive medical knowledge while preserving the victim's consciousness long enough to experience terror of being buried alive. The psychological preparation required perhaps even more discipline than mastering the involved chemistry. Solomon had to maintain his gentle, helpful demeanor while internally preparing to watch men suffer in ways violating everything his healing nature represented. He justified this transformation by regularly reviewing his children's names in his journal, reminding himself of their fate and callous indifference from men who had profited from their sale. As winter approached in 1852, Solomon had identified his first target, Colonel Reginald Fitzpatrick, a wealthy rice planter who had not only attended the auction where Solomon's family was sold but loudly joked about the breeding potential of children offered for sale. Fitzpatrick suffered from chronic gout and visited Dr. Hathaway's practice monthly for treatments providing temporary relief. The Colonel's regular appointments, his trust in Solomon's medical abilities, and his habit of arriving alone made him an ideal first victim for Solomon's carefully planned revenge campaign. But Solomon forced himself to wait, knowing patience and perfect execution would be essential for avoiding suspicion and ensuring all 9 men received deserved justice. In his journal, Solomon wrote detailed profiles of each intended victim, noting their medical conditions, treatment schedules, and slave trade involvement. These entries read like physicians' case notes documenting a very different treatment plan, one designed not to heal but to ensure 9 men experienced the same helpless terror Solomon's children had felt when torn from everything they'd ever known. The transformation of Solomon Fairfax from healer to methodical killer began with meticulous preparation spanning the entire year of 1852. Every detail had to be perfect, every contingency planned, every variable controlled. The men he intended to target were not isolated individuals but pillars of Charleston society whose deaths would be scrutinized by the city's most prominent physicians and investigated by authorities under intense pressure to find explanations. Solomon's first step involved establishing himself as indispensable to Dr. Hathaway's practice. He began arriving earlier each morning preparing the office, staying later each evening organizing medical supplies, and demonstrating such dedication that Dr. Hathaway increasingly relied on his judgment in medical matters. This growing trust would be essential when Solomon needed to handle certain patients independently without the doctor's direct supervision. Developing his paralytic compound required months of careful refinement. Working in a small shed behind Dr. Hathaway's office, ostensibly preparing herbal remedies supplementing the doctor's treatments, Solomon cultivated the toxic vine and experimented with extraction methods. The process was dangerous. Several times he accidentally exposed himself to small toxin amounts, experiencing temporary numbness giving terrifying preview of what his victims would endure in final hours. The compound in final form was a colorless, odorless liquid easily mixed with other medications without detection. When administered in correct dosage, it would begin taking effect within 30 minutes, initially causing weakness and disorientation attributed to the patient's existing medical condition. Within an hour, complete paralysis would set in, but the victim would remain conscious and able to hear, see, and feel everything happening around them. Most crucially, the paralysis would be so complete that breathing or pulse detection would be impossible without extremely careful examination. To 1850s physicians lacking modern diagnostic equipment, a patient treated with Solomon's compound would appear to have died peacefully from natural causes. Only someone with extensive knowledge of the toxin's properties would recognize subtle signs indicating the victim was still alive but completely immobilized. Solomon's selection of Colonel Reginald Fitzpatrick as his first victim was both strategic and personal. Fitzpatrick's monthly visits for gout treatment provided predictable schedule, and his arrogant demeanor made him particularly easy to despise. More importantly, Fitzpatrick lived alone except for house slaves terrified of him, making it unlikely anyone would insist on extended wake or detailed post-mortem examination. The Colonel's medical history provided Solomon with perfect cover story. Fitzpatrick suffered not only from gout but also from a weak heart, a condition Dr. Hathaway had monitored for several years. If Fitzpatrick died suddenly, heart failure would be the obvious diagnosis requiring no further investigation or autopsy. On December 15, 1852, Colonel Fitzpatrick arrived for his regular appointment, complaining his gout pain had worsened significantly over the past week. Dr. Hathaway was attending another patient, so he instructed Solomon to prepare Fitzpatrick's usual treatment and begin consultation. This routine delegation provided exactly the opportunity Solomon had awaited. As Solomon prepared the Colonel's medication, he added precisely measured drops of his paralytic compound to the solution. Years of medical practice had taught him steady hands and calm expression even in stressful situations, skills serving him well as he crossed from healer to killer. Fitzpatrick, accustomed to receiving treatments from Solomon, consumed the medication without question or hesitation. The following conversation would be burned into Solomon's memory forever. As the toxin took effect and Fitzpatrick began feeling weak, Solomon sat beside the Colonel's chair and spoke in the same gentle tone always used with patients. "Colonel Fitzpatrick," Solomon said quietly, "I want you to know my name is Solomon Fairfax, and you destroyed my family at the slave auction on March 14, 1851. You laughed when my children were sold. You joked about their value as breeding stock. Do you remember that day?" Fitzpatrick's eyes, already glazing from advancing paralysis, showed recognition flicker and then growing horror as he realized what was happening. He tried to speak, to call for help, but found his voice stolen along with his ability to move. Solomon continued in that same calm, professional tone. "You're not dying yet, Colonel. The medicine I gave you has paralyzed every muscle, but your mind is completely clear. You can hear every word I'm saying. You can feel everything happening to you. In about an hour, Dr. Hathaway will examine you and pronounce you dead from heart failure. Your body will be prepared for burial, and tomorrow evening, you'll be placed in your coffin and buried in St. Michael's Cemetery." Solomon leaned closer, ensuring Fitzpatrick could see his face clearly. "But you won't actually die until several hours after burial. You'll be completely aware as dirt is shoveled onto your coffin. You'll hear every sound, feel every sensation, and have plenty of time to think about what you did to my children. That's when you'll understand what terror really feels like." The paralysis was now complete. Fitzpatrick appeared a corpse, but Solomon could see desperate awareness in his eyes, frantic effort to somehow communicate or escape his immobilized body. Solomon checked the colonel's pulse and breathing with professional thoroughness, confirming both were so faint as to be undetectable without specialized instruments. When Dr. Hathaway entered the treatment room 5 minutes later, he found Solomon standing respectfully beside what appeared to be Colonel Fitzpatrick's body, his expression showing appropriate concern and sadness. "I'm afraid the colonel has passed, Doctor," Solomon reported quietly. "His heart gave out while I prepared his next treatment. He seemed to go very peacefully." Dr. Hathaway's examination confirmed Solomon's diagnosis. The colonel showed no life signs, and given his known heart condition, the cause seemed obvious. Within an hour, the body was removed to Fitzpatrick's mansion where funeral arrangements befitting one of Charleston's most prominent citizens proceeded. Solomon attended the funeral, standing respectfully in the section designated for slaves while Colonel Fitzpatrick's coffin was lowered into the ground. As the first shovelfuls of dirt struck the wooden lid, Solomon wondered if Fitzpatrick remained conscious, still aware of what was happening. The thought brought no satisfaction, only cold sense of justice finally served. That evening, Solomon made the second journal entry: "Colonel Fitzpatrick has paid for his crimes. 8 more remain. Justice is patient, but it is also certain." The months following Colonel Fitzpatrick's burial passed with agonizing slowness as Solomon waited to see if his method had aroused suspicion. Charleston's social circles buzzed with expected condolences and remembrances of the colonel's community contributions, but no questions were raised about his death circumstances. Dr. Hathaway mentioned the case to other physicians as an example of how quickly heart failure could claim even seemingly healthy individuals. And Solomon's reputation as a skilled, caring medical assistant remained untarnished. This successful first revenge gave Solomon confidence to proceed with his plan's second phase. But it also forced confronting the psychological toll of his actions. Despite years of careful preparation and absolute certainty about his cause's justice, actually watching a man die in terror had affected him more deeply than expected. He found himself unable to sleep for weeks afterward, not from guilt but from vivid imagination of what Fitzpatrick had experienced in those final hours buried alive. Selecting his second victim required careful timing and method consideration. Solomon needed to avoid establishing any pattern eventually attracting attention, meaning varying both intervals between deaths and apparent causes. His research had identified Judge Marcus Calverton as an ideal second target, a man who had not only witnessed Solomon's family sale but provided legal justification for separating slave families, arguing in court such practices were essential for maintaining order and maximizing economic efficiency. Judge Calverton suffered from severe migraines progressively worsening over the past 2 years, forcing increasingly frequent treatment from Dr. Hathaway. The judge's condition provided Solomon with both opportunity and cover. Migraine sufferers occasionally suffered fatal strokes, and Calverton's advanced age made such outcome medically plausible. But before Solomon could implement his plan against Judge Calverton, an unexpected complication nearly derailed his entire revenge campaign. In March 1853, Dr. Hathaway announced considering a junior partner, a young physician named Dr. Timothy Henderson who had recently completed medical training in Philadelphia and was eager establishing himself in Charleston's competitive medical community. Dr. Henderson's addition would mean increased scrutiny of Solomon's activities, more witnesses to patient interactions, and greater difficulty administering his paralytic compound without detection. Even more concerning, Dr. Henderson had trained under physicians familiar with latest forensic medicine advances, including techniques for detecting unusual substances in deceased patients. Solomon realized he would need to accelerate his timeline significantly. Rather than spacing victims over several years as originally planned, he would need completing his mission within months before Dr. Henderson's presence made continued operations impossible. This schedule compression would require greater risks and accepting less than perfect conditions for some planned murders. The pressure to move quickly led Solomon to his first serious mistake. While preparing Judge Calverton's treatment in April 1853, Solomon accidentally used a slightly higher dose of his paralytic compound than intended. The judge's apparent death occurred more rapidly than expected, and paralysis intensity was so complete even Dr. Hathaway noticed something unusual about the body's condition. "Strange," Dr. Hathaway murmured examining Judge Calverton's corpse. "The muscle rigidity seems more pronounced than typical for stroke victims. And look at his eyes, there's something almost desperate about their expression." Solomon's heart raced as he watched Dr. Hathaway conduct more thorough examination than performed on Colonel Fitzpatrick. For several terrifying minutes, Solomon feared his entire plan was about exposure. But Dr. Hathaway's medical training, though thorough for its time, lacked specific knowledge needed to recognize Solomon's exotic toxin effects. After 15 minutes examination, the doctor concluded unusual symptoms resulted simply from Judge Calverton's particularly severe stroke. "Poor man must have suffered terribly in his final moments," Dr. Hathaway observed, unknowingly describing exactly what Judge Calverton was experiencing at that very moment, paralyzed but conscious as his body was prepared for burial. Judge Calverton's funeral was attended by even more prominent citizens than Colonel Fitzpatrick's, befitting a man serving Charleston's legal community for over 30 years. Solomon watched from the slave section as the judge's coffin was lowered into St. Michael's Cemetery, just 3 rows from Colonel Fitzpatrick's grave. As the funeral concluded, Solomon noticed something sending chill through his blood, a young man standing near the crowd's back, carefully taking notes in a small leather book. The note-taker was Thomas Grimby, a journalist for the Charleston Mercury who had begun investigating what he privately called the prominent deaths phenomenon. A series of sudden fatalities among the city's elite seeming statistically unlikely. Grimby had noticed over the past 6 months, Charleston had lost several wealthy citizens to unexpected medical emergencies, all under medically explainable but collectively suspicious circumstances. Solomon's journal entry that evening reflected growing awareness that time was running out. "Judge Calverton has joined Colonel Fitzpatrick in experiencing true justice. But I fear others are noticing patterns threatening my mission's completion. I must work faster, even accepting greater risks." The timeline acceleration meant his third victim would need elimination within weeks rather than months. He selected Captain William Dandridge, a ship owner who had transported slaves from Charleston to markets throughout the South and personally supervised human cargo loading with same attention to detail he showed handling valuable cotton shipments. Captain Dandridge presented unique targeting challenges. Unlike previous victims visiting Dr. Hathaway's office regularly for chronic conditions, Dandridge was generally healthy and only sought medical attention for minor maritime injuries. Solomon would need creating opportunity rather than awaiting natural occurrence. The solution came through Solomon's contacts among Charleston's slave community. Kitchen slaves working in grand houses along the Battery often gathered information about masters' activities and shared with slaves from other households. Through these informal intelligence networks, Solomon learned Captain Dandridge was planning a dinner party for prominent Charleston shipping community members scheduled for May 20, 1853. The dinner party would provide perfect opportunity to eliminate his third victim while gathering intelligence about potential future targets. Kitchen staff for such events were often borrowed from other households, and Solomon had established friendships with several slaves working in food preparation. With careful planning, he could arrange assisting with dinner service, giving direct access to Captain Dandridge and his guests. But even as Solomon refined dinner party plans, Thomas Grimby conducted his own investigation into Charleston's recent prominent deaths. The journalist had begun regularly visiting St. Michael's Cemetery, noting recent burial locations and documenting deceased medical histories. What he discovered would soon threaten everything Solomon had accomplished. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in Charleston intensifies. If this story gives you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button supporting our content. And don't forget subscribing to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next. The evening of May 20, 1853 marked the beginning of the end for Solomon Fairfax's methodical revenge campaign. The dinner party at Captain Dandridge's mansion on East Bay Street brought together 12 of Charleston's most influential shipping merchants, creating unprecedented opportunity for Solomon to study multiple potential victims while eliminating his primary target. Solomon had arranged participation through Martha, an elderly slave supervising kitchen operations for many of Charleston's grandest social events. Martha, unaware of Solomon's true intentions, was grateful for his offer, helping serve the elaborate meal since several regular assistants had fallen ill with fever spreading through the French Quarter's slave quarters. The captain's dining room gleamed with crystal and silver as Charleston's maritime elite gathered, discussing shipping route expansion and increasing human cargo transport profitability. Solomon moved through the room with practiced invisibility, refilling wine glasses and clearing plates while listening to conversations revealing casual brutality underlying Charleston's economic prosperity. Captain Dandridge, a robust man in his early 50s with graying hair and weathered hands, speaking of decades at sea, held court at the table's head, regaling guests with profitable voyage stories and strategies for maximizing slave shipment value. His detailed knowledge of techniques preventing slave rebellions during transport and methods keeping human cargo alive during long voyages made him particularly contemptible in Solomon's eyes. As evening progressed, Solomon identified several other men whose slave trade involvement marked them as future targets. Overheard conversations revealed complicity networks extending far beyond individual traders participating in his family's sale. These men discussed human beings with detached interest they showed for cotton prices or shipping schedules, viewing family destruction as acceptable business cost. Solomon's opportunity came during final course service, an elaborate dessert requiring individual guest preparation. Working in Captain Dandridge's kitchen, Solomon carefully added his paralytic compound to the captain's brandy-soaked cake portion, using a method perfected through months of experimentation. The toxin absorbed into the alcohol-soaked dessert, masking any potential taste while ensuring rapid victim system absorption. Captain Dandridge consumed dessert with obvious enjoyment, complimenting Martha on exceptional preparation and requesting the recipe for his own cook. Within 30 minutes, he began experiencing Solomon's compound's initial effects, slight dizziness attributed to evening's wine consumption and the crowded dining room's warmth. As paralysis progressed, Captain Dandridge excused himself from the table, claiming need for fresh air clearing his head. Solomon, observing from the kitchen doorway, watched the captain make his way to his private study where he collapsed into his favorite leather chair just as toxin reached full effect. The discovery of Captain Dandridge's death 20 minutes later created exactly the scene Solomon had hoped to avoid. Instead of dying quietly in Dr. Hathaway's office privacy, the captain had expired before 12 witnesses immediately demanding answers. Dr. Samuel Pettigrew, one of the dinner guests, examined the body while others watched with growing alarm. "This is most peculiar," Dr. Pettigrew announced after initial examination. "Captain Dandridge appears suffering some seizure form, but there are no obvious apoplexy or heart failure symptoms. The muscle rigidity is quite pronounced, almost as if he'd been poisoned." The word "poisoned" sent shock through assembled guests and created exactly the attention Solomon had worked to avoid. Within an hour, 2 additional physicians had been summoned examining Captain Dandridge's body, and by morning, suspicious death news had spread throughout Charleston social circles. Thomas Grimby, the journalist tracking prominent deaths, arrived at Captain Dandridge's mansion before dawn, interviewing servants and guests while evening details were still fresh. His investigation revealed Solomon's presence at the dinner party, marking first time any individual could be connected to multiple recent Charleston elite deaths. The net was closing around Solomon, but his mission remained incomplete. 6 intended victims still lived, and increasing scrutiny made it unlikely he would have opportunities eliminating them using established methods. Desperation and knowledge that time was running out led Solomon to his campaign's most dangerous decision. He would attempt killing multiple targets simultaneously, using a method ensuring maximum terror even if it meant exposing himself to almost certain capture. Solomon's research had identified a private meeting scheduled for June 15, 1853, when 6 of Charleston's most prominent slave traders would gather at Henderson and Associates' offices finalizing contracts for major operation expansion. The meeting would take place in the evening after normal business hours, providing Solomon opportunity trapping all 6 men in confined space. The plan developed was both ingenious and terrifying in its simplicity. Working at night over 2 weeks, Solomon used medical supply access to prepare large quantities of his paralytic compound in highly concentrated form. Instead of administering toxin individually to each victim, he would introduce it into the building's air supply using the gas lighting system illuminating the office. The Henderson and Associates building employed a central gas distribution system feeding individual lamps throughout the structure. By injecting concentrated toxin into the main gas line, Solomon could ensure everyone in the building would be exposed to lethal compound doses within minutes of lamps being lit for the evening meeting. On June 15 night, Solomon positioned himself in the alley behind Henderson and Associates building, waiting for 6 men arriving for their clandestine meeting. At exactly 8 o'clock, office windows began glowing with gas lamplight, indicating meeting commencement and Solomon's trap activation. Within 30 minutes, the building fell silent. Solomon waited another hour ensuring complete paralysis before using a duplicate key obtained through careful planning to enter through the rear entrance. The scene greeting him in the main conference room was both horrifying and satisfying. 6 men sat around a mahogany table, bodies frozen in positions occupied when paralysis struck. Their eyes, the only anatomy part still capable of movement, tracked Solomon moving around the room, revealing terror and awareness trapped within immobilized bodies. Solomon approached each man individually, speaking in the same calm, professional tone used with previous victims. He identified himself and explained exactly what was happening, describing in clinical detail how they would remain conscious throughout burial and the suffocation hours following. The expressions in their eyes, panic, disbelief, desperate attempts to communicate, provided Solomon satisfaction years of planning hadn't prepared him to experience. But Solomon's triumph moment was short-lived. As he prepared leaving the building allowing victim discovery the following morning, he heard footsteps in the corridor outside the conference room. Someone else was in the building, someone not supposed to be there according to Solomon's careful meeting surveillance. The door opened revealing Thomas Grimby, the journalist investigating Charleston's recent suspicious deaths. Grimby had been following leads pointing to tonight's meeting as crucial investigation piece, and he arrived just in time witnessing Solomon standing over 6 apparently dead bodies. "So it's true," Grimby said quietly, his voice showing horror and vindication mixture. "Someone has systematically murdered Charleston's elite, and you're responsible." Solomon realized his careful plans had finally unraveled completely. There was no way explaining his room presence or 6 convenient deaths of his targets. The journalist's investigation had led him to the same conclusion Charleston's authorities would soon reach. Someone with medical knowledge access and detailed victim schedule information had conducted methodical murder campaign. "They destroyed my family," Solomon said simply, making no attempt denying responsibility. "They sold my children like cattle and left my wife dying roadside. This is justice, not murder." Grimby's response revealed Charleston's racial dynamics complexity even facing obvious crime. As journalist, he was committed to murder truth exposure. As Southerner, he understood brutal slave system realities motivating Solomon's revenge. The conflict between these perspectives created hesitation moment determining both men's fates. "Those men in there," Grimby said gesturing toward paralyzed victims, "they're still alive, aren't they? That's why their eyes move. You've done something making them appear dead while keeping them conscious." Solomon nodded, seeing no point denying obvious truth. "They'll experience exactly what my children felt when torn from everything they knew. They'll have hours thinking about their actions, just as my family had hours contemplating their fate during that wagon ride to the slave market." The following conversation would be recorded in Grimby's own journal discovered decades later during his former residence renovation. The journalist found himself caught between professional obligation exposing mass murder and human understanding of injustices creating that murderer. "I can't let you continue," Grimby said finally. "But I also can't ignore what drove you to this. Those men participated in a system treating human beings as property. They profited from breaking families and selling children. In any just society, they would face consequences. Solomon's response revealed philosophical framework sustaining him through 4 planning and execution years. In a just society, my family would never have been destroyed. Since justice was denied us through legal means, I created my own justice through knowledge their system taught me. The standoff between Solomon and Grimby was interrupted by approaching voices outside the building. Others were coming investigating the meeting, either expected attendees or someone noticing unusual building activity. Both men realized within minutes the scene would be discovered and Solomon's fate sealed. "There's a back stairs," Grimby said quietly. "You could still escape. I could delay reporting this a few hours, give you countryside reach time." But Solomon had already accepted his mission would end with capture or death. 9 men had been responsible for his family's destruction, and he had eliminated only 6. The remaining 3 would live profiting from crimes, and the system creating those crimes would continue unchanged. "I'm not running," Solomon said with calm certainty characterizing all his actions. "Let them come. Let them discover what I've done. Maybe when this story spreads, other people will understand that even slaves have limits to what they'll silently endure." The voices outside grew louder, accompanied by multiple footsteps on the building's front stairs. Grimby made a decision haunting him for life. He chose protecting his story rather than protecting Solomon. The journalist positioned himself observing and documenting what happened next, ensuring complete account of Solomon's capture and victim discovery. When Charleston city constables burst into the conference room, they found a scene defying immediate explanation. 6 prominent citizens sat motionless around a conference table, apparently dead but showing none of natural death's typical signs. Standing calmly beside the table was a slave making no attempt fleeing or resisting arrest, instead offering complete confession of his actions and detailed method explanation. Solomon's confession, recorded by Chief Constable and preserved in Charleston's criminal archives, provided authorities with information solving not only the evening's multiple deaths but also mysterious fatalities puzzling the city's medical community for nearly 2 years: the paralytic compound, administration method, victim selection based on slave trading involvement. Everything was documented with same methodical precision characterizing Solomon's revenge campaign. Solomon Fairfax's trial became one of the most controversial legal proceedings in Charleston's antebellum history, not from guilt doubt but from moral questions his case raised about slavery, justice, and human endurance limits. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Charles Rutledge, presented the case as simple murder, a slave killing 9 prominent citizens requiring execution for social order maintenance. The defense, appointed by court and led by reluctant attorney Benjamin Crawford, faced nearly impossible task defending a client confessing multiple murders while arguing those murders were justified by systematic family destruction. Crawford's strategy focused not on denying Solomon's guilt but exposing brutal slave system realities creating conditions for such desperate revenge. The trial revealed Charleston slave trade details previously hidden from public view, testimony about family separation methods, slave auction casual cruelty, and enslaved people's complete legal powerlessness creating uncomfortable mirror for a society preferring viewing slavery as benevolent institution. Solomon's detailed testimony about watching family destroyed while unable to intervene forced Charleston's elite confronting human consequences of their economic system. Thomas Grimby's trial coverage for the Charleston Mercury created sensation throughout the South. His articles, including extensive Solomon Journal excerpts and detailed paralytic compound descriptions, were reprinted in newspapers from Virginia to Louisiana. The story of a slave turning medical knowledge into revenge instrument became fascination and terror source for slave owners throughout the region. Solomon's crimes' medical aspects received particular scientific community attention. Dr. Hathaway, devastated learning his trusted assistant had used the practice as murder base, provided detailed testimony about Solomon's pharmaceutical knowledge and exotic compound access. The revelation that slaves could possess sophisticated chemistry and toxicology understanding challenged prevailing intellectual capability assumptions and sparked debates about educating enslaved people wisdom. The 6 men paralyzed in Henderson and Associates building provided the trial's most dramatic testimony. All had survived their ordeal, though their experiences varied in horror depending on how long each remained conscious after apparent death. Their accounts of lying paralyzed while fully aware, hearing their own death pronounced, and funeral arrangements discussed created visceral understanding of Solomon's revenge mere.